Hello everyone, and welcome back to Jlunce Reviews. It is a cold, windy day over in Kansas, and today we're talking about a new album, Mac Miller's second posthumous album, Balloonerism, which is an album that, while I'm sure has been met with a lot of elation and excitement from Mac Miller's fans, his fan base, I don't consider myself a fan, it is also an album that is not entirely his work, obviously. Much of the material on this album was recorded, I believe, in the Watch Movies with the Sound Off, as well as a Good AM era of his career, and was put together by Mac Miller's estate. Another thing that I probably don't really need to remind you of is that posthumous albums are kind of a sour topic in the music industry as a whole. Most of the reason behind releasing projects from artists after their passing is to mooch off the fan base, off the audience that that artist has earned and gained over the years that they were once alive. Sometimes whenever a beloved artist with huge, giant fan base passes away, we run into a situation where it's basically grave robbery to the highest bidder, to whoever's paying the most, and the actual album output quality for these projects is usually pretty bad. I mean, honestly, when I heard this was releasing, on the one hand, the last time Mac's estate did this, it did go over pretty well. But getting an album of that same quality with recordings that are nearly a decade old at this point would be a very, very tall task, possibly the tallest of tasks when it comes to making an album in this nature. And just a couple months ago, we saw a prime example of what happens with most releases of this type with Juice WRLD's The Party Never Ends, which was an album that honestly kind of disgusted me because of how soulless and obvious the agenda was for whatever record producers or label execs greenlit the release of that album. So going into this, I was cautiously optimistic, and after listening to it, while I don't think this is Mac Miller's best album or anything like that, it does still feel like a loving tribute to Mac and his legacy. And honestly, if this record was released in like 2015 and 2016, I would believe that he recorded it and produced it himself. It still does feel wholly his own, his vision. It doesn't sound tattered or unfinished, soulless or gutless. In fact, this album really doesn't feel all that similar to any of his past works, but in a good way. It feels like an interesting progression, not a random tangent of some sort. I wouldn't call Balloonerism experimental, at least in the traditional sense, but I would say it's different in regards to Mac's normal sound. I think that distinction is ever so clear once you actually dive into the bulk of tracks on this project. The first and only feature, technically, of this album comes in the form of DJ's chord organ, which has appearance from SZA, and many people were very excited to see what a collaboration between SZA and Mac Miller would look like, being as both of them are very well versed in the modern alternative R&B scene. And as per usual, SZA really brings it vocally, as she has much more of a strained emotion to her performance on this. She's not really overdoing it at all and goes a bit more gentle. The jazzy organs and blissful background vocals from Mac, as well as Thundercat, I believe, really adds to the cloudy, trippy atmosphere in a really cool way. But I do think that the production overall feels a little bit jumbled, and the song is saddled by an intro that, with the organs, that lasts far too long, unfortunately. And I also wish that Mac had a greater presence on the track, as he doesn't even have a verse. And this did worry me at the very start, because if this was how Mac was going to be incorporated into the song vocally, then how would the rest of the project pan out? How would it sound? How would he be used? How would his vocals be used in the rest of the tracks? But thankfully, my fears were immediately put into check once I heard the following cut, Do You Have a Destination, which is pretty fucking amazing. It's this serene blend of neo soul and East Coast hip hop that plays to Mac's strengths really well, but also fits the cloudiness that surrounds Mac's thoughts about his life and where he might be years down down the road or even in another life. As he says in the first verse, pray this life reciprocal, and I'ma come back an eagle, thirsty for evil, the wine chilled in hell, right here. Which is especially haunting given Mac's untimely passing. But yeah, the snares and the hypnotic piano chords that play throughout this give this feeling of ascending to heaven on a pillowy cushion while being high out of your mind. The vibes in this track are pretty fantastic, and this is a sound that Mac had perfected long before he passed away. So it's no surprise that it works here. But truthfully, a lot of this record does feel in a way like purgatory, as if waiting for a higher calling, waiting for that chance to see your loved ones. But still, there's a need to reconcile with your past one more time, reflect on why you would want to be there in the first place. I think the production being assisted by Thundercat and Flying Lotus as well throughout this thing really reinforces that feeling. Seeing as a lot of this material was recorded around the middle of Mac's career, it's an intriguing idea to give listeners another glimpse into what Mac may have been dealing with halfway through his career, at a time where he may have been dealing with these dark, contemplative thoughts. But while there are tracks similar to this, like Mrs. Deborah Downer or Excelsior, another great track on the album, I love the instrumental on that thing, really woozy, really boom bap, really bassy. These two tracks also dive into heavy feelings of depression and life callings in a slightly boyish, lovingly juvenile way that only Mac Miller could pull off. But by that same token, there are also some tracks that have a more positive outlook, or maybe a song's just kind of vibe to chill out to while sitting in bed, or just relaxing in general, or maybe thinking about like a romantic relationship or something like that. But they are still genuine songs about the mode of bliss that weed or lean could put you into. Think tracks like Stoned or Pony Rides, the former of which has these warbly psychedelic synthesizers phasing in and out of both channels, while Pony Rides is a much more head in the clouds sort of feel, which has a thumping bass, these jangly tambourine bells, and eccentric otherworldly background vocals from Thundercat. Once again, the lyrics showcase this clever metaphor about relating the quickness and fleeting happiness that drugs give you with a $5 pony ride that only lasts as long as the couple of quarters you pay for it. Mac raps about how this fix helps him cope with the sadness he feels from being in a long distance relationship. And lyrically, that's one of my favorite cuts here, for sure. I also like a lot of the lyrical ties to Rick Rubin, one of the most important and beloved producers in hip hop and rock music the past like several decades. He's mentioned at several points on this album, specifically on songs like Shangri-La or Rick's Piano. Shangri-La admittedly doesn't have one of the more captivating instrumentals, especially with the deep voice automated vocals throughout that reminds me of like Tyler, the Creator's Goblin, which is an album I don't need to be reminded of. Still though, it's interesting to hear Mac rap about these people or places that meant so much to him at a time that he was clearly at a low point mentally and emotionally. But Rick's Piano especially highlights just how important Rick was in aiding Mac in these dark times, as it references the story about how Mac drunk dialed Rick Rubin asking to hang out, and how he would frequent his Malibu house and just talk to him every day, and how he got cleaned over that and learned a lot from working with him as a producer, or just plain old conversation. On the track, Mac brings up burning questions about what death feels like, but not really the death of himself as a human, but more like the death of his past self, I think, the person that gave him the success he has today, and how he never wants that part of himself to die, the part of him that makes him who he is today, part of him that gave him the fame and fortune that he has now, or had now at the time. The keyboards on this track are extremely prominent, playing simple minor chords and lower notes to exemplify the sorrow position he was in at this point. But to counteract this a bit, Mac adds this the best is yet to come hook that is sung with just a tinge of hopefulness. It's a gorgeous track that highlights a really important moment for Mac in his life that calls back to his many problems he had with self-doubt, negativity in general. But my favorite songwriting comes in the form of Funny Papers, which takes a brisk, nostalgic, Vince Guaraldi-esque approach to the piano with its jazz rap instrumental. But as I said, it's the lyrics here that really stand out, as Mac basically hones in on the highs and lows of life and relates it to reading the funny papers in a newspaper, and how you may see the joyful positives in life, but then a second later in the next block of text, the next article, you might find a story about death or hardship or people in need. He raps about how happiness is temporary, like a balancing act. It's interesting to hear Mac make sense of something so abstract and relate to it with something as simple as a newspaper comic strip. I will say that while most of the album is pretty great and super solid, it does end in a kind of unsatisfying way with Tomorrow We'll Never Know, which is 12 minutes long, and you really do feel the length of it, especially with how minimal and skeletal the instrumental is in the second half, which is preceded by a verse that is okay, but nothing spectacular as far as songwriting goes. It kind of did leave the album going out with more of a whimper. I was also not a fan of the downward spiral madness that is Transformations, where Mac brings out his alter ego once again that he's used before in the past, delusional Thomas. It's had an internal battle with his mental issues. It works thematically and the concept is kind of intriguing, but it does not make for very enjoyable listening, especially with some of the really eyebrow-raising lyrics, like that lingering fart line, which, I mean, it's kind of funny, but tonally just does not fit the context of the track or the rest of the album really at all. But those issues notwithstanding, this was still a really great album and proves that posthumous records can still be handled very well in the right hands. Listening to this with a friend of mine, he said that even though he liked the album overall, he still wished that it didn't really exist because there's just no real need for it. Mac's legacy has been given the respect that it deserved, and the two records he left us with are some of the best in his entire catalog. And I respect that point of view. I think it makes sense. It's totally a valid argument. And while I can sympathize with the sentiment around the unnecessary nature of and the greedy tactics that surround most posthumous releases, Mac Miller is one of the very, very, very few artists that has been treated with some modicum of respect when it comes to musical legacy. And this record has proven to be another successful attempt at giving listeners another moment to feel as if he's actually still with us, as fleeting as that moment may be. Yeah, so that's it. Let me know what you thought about this thing. Rest in peace, Mac Miller. And yeah, see you guys next time.